Thank you. So when you read histories of the community of true inspiration, you very rarely come across the person called Giesebert Nagel, who I'm going to talk about today. If he is mentioned, he's usually rightfully recognized as taking a real leadership role in the community after the death of the last Werkzeug, Johann Friedrich Rock, in 1749. And in truth, he really did keep things going. And I think his role can be characterized better than leadership. I think you could say it's existential, because it's not an exaggeration to say that if not for the efforts of Nagel, that flame of religious enthusiasm that was ignited by the early Werkzeug and that grew into the community of true inspiration might actually have flickered out in the later 18th century. Now, we don't really know much about Nagel, however. We know he was born in Esslingen, Germany in 1715, which was right about the time when the Inspirationists were starting, so he was a latecomer. His father, Wolfgang Philipp, was a well-to-do lawyer. His mother died when he was very young, in 1724 already. He was just 9 years old. And he joined the Inspirationist community in Neuwied in 1740. His father died in 1744. He lived until 1779. Now, we don't even know why he joined the community or why he moved to Neuwied. Neuwied is up further north, Esslingen is down south. It wasn't really, that community wasn't close to his hometown, so we don't really know what made him go there. The story goes that he gave up a career in law, that he had studied law, just as his father had, but he gave up that career in order to lead a quiet and withdrawn life. Well, if that's true, and I don't know if it is or not, he certainly changed his tune, because by the time he joined once he joined the Inspirationists, his life was anything but quiet and withdrawn. He did a lot, and with his travels, with his the conversations he had with people, with all his writings, he has left behind a remarkable corpus of historical resources. Resources that, if you look in our church archive, probably more than 75% of what we have in our church archive for the 18th century is there because of Nagel. These are some of the sources that we have, thanks to Powell, I should say, right? We have over 100 letters written by him or to him in our archives. We have about a dozen accounts of the spiritual examinations that the community went through, the Unterredung, that really focused on individuals and what their spiritual condition was. And these are detailed records. Probably total pages of those accounts probably are 3,000 or 4,000 pages of accounts of those Unterredungen. We have testimony manuscripts. He spent every spare moment he had, I think, copying testimonies down into manuscript form, and we have lots of those. Here's an example of one of those. This is actually in Nagel's handwriting. This is an original where he's got, that's the title page, where he's noting that these are some of the first testimonies given in the community. And of course, he's doing this some 50 years almost after the fact. So he's going back and copying these manuscripts. We have, I don't want to get too involved with the numbers, but we probably have 20,000 pages of these manuscripts in our archive. He also didn't just make manuscripts, he brought them to print. Because of Nagel's efforts, we have a lot of Rock's testimonies and Gleim's testimonies, some of the earlier ones that were published, and it was Nagel who put it all together and to publish it in form, went to the effort of proofreading it, working with the printer, and getting that all published. He actually, and he wrote the first history of the community. In the early 1770s, he actually wrote a history of the community of true inspiration that started at the beginning, and and then printed it as well. Then there's a remarkable document called the Hauptregister, which translates basically as the main register. And this is the main register of every testimony delivered by the 18th century Werkzeuge. There are almost 4,000 testimonies listed in this. And remember, Nagel was doing this decades after the fact. He was writing letters to people, do you have any of these testimonies? Do you have anything that you can send me? And he not only copied them, then he compiled it into a Hauptregister, into a usable form. Oh, that's right, this has a little thing.
Yeah.
where he gives the date of the testimony, where it was, who the Werkzeug was. He gives the first and the last words of the testimony so that you know you're talking about the right one. He makes notes about the context, where, who was there, was it directed to somebody. He gives you all this information. It's about 360 pages on this manuscript. And it's a really detailed record, chronological record of what was happening. It really records the travels of the Werkzeug, the worship services, both internal and external conflicts of the community. And like I say, it's an invaluable chronology of how things were happening. And it provides a framework for understanding everything else we have in that period of time. And what's remarkable, I think, is that nobody's ever used it. And you look at all the scholarship, and there's no reference to it anywhere. But even more and then there are two people who used it. That's me and John Bendorf. And John Bendorf and I, a few years ago, we decided, let's figure out what this thing is. We knew what it was. Let's figure out what it was, what exactly it is. And so we decided, just for fun, let's see how many of these testimonies we still have today. So we made a database. We called it the Neues Hauptregister. That takes Nagel's data. That is the date of the testimony, the location, who the Werkzeug was, some of the first words, some of the context around it. We made a database of that, and then took it further and noted where we could find it in manuscript form in the archive today, if it was printed, what book it was printed in, and whether it had been translated or not. And as a result of our search, we found all but 18 of those 3,975 testimonies we still have today. And that's thanks to Paul Nagel, actually. So, and what also was interesting, I think we found, 40 or 50 new testimonies that Nagel wasn't aware of, but that was actually still in our archives today. And then John didn't just rest with that. He has gone back, as you can see here, not just the first words. John has gone back and put in like the first few sentences of each testimony. And then later on, you don't see it. It would be like over there on that chimney. He's also put links into the translations of all the testimonies. So if you go to the Inspirationist Archive webpage and go to this Neues Hauptregister, you can just click on a testimony and and read the translation right there. So John has put a whole lot of work into that. But my favorite Nagel document, excuse me, I learned my lesson last week. I had coffee up here, and that didn't help. My favorite Nagel document is his diary. We have very few diaries of inspirationists. This is we've got Nagel's diary that was kept. He kept it from 1743 until 1776, and very detailed. There's just a couple years missing, and what's even, that's kind of hard to read. What's even better is that in the 18th century, two guys, Johann Georg Heimberger and then Joseph Gumbel, took it upon themselves to transcribe this diary into more readable form. It's still in the German script, okay, so it's not that readable, but it's a lot more readable than this. And those transcriptions actually amounts to 8 volumes, totaling 5,200 pages. So that's how much of a diary this guy left. It was pretty serious work. I like to conceptualize the diary using the 3 R's. There's reisen, traveling, reden, conversing, and rhymen. There goes Ryman Paul. Remember the Paul Simon album? There goes Ryman Simon. Well, they must have said that. They must have said that about Nagel, because he's always writing in rhyme, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of reisen, he's also always traveling. I haven't really done the calculations, but I think it's safe to say that even though he lived in Neuwied, he spent over half of his life on the road, not at home. At one point, he was gone from June 1754 until October 1755. Some 16 months he was traveling. And he notes in his diary when he gets home, he notes how happy he is to finally be home. But then to show the human side, he says, unfortunately, 4 people I knew are no longer here, though it died while he was gone. Now, he sometimes had travel companions. Jonas Wickmark, another important character that I can't really talk about today, and also Jakob Rock, who was the nephew of Johann Friedrich Rock, often accompanied Nagel on his travels. And then locals accompanied him too, like from town to town. He'd be in one town one day, and then the people there would accompany him to the next town. Very interesting, because it wasn't always men accompanying him either. Often he had women helping him and showing him the way and which way to go from town to town. He talks about modes of travel. He traveled on the Postwagen, the post wagon, on market ships, on chases, sleds, wagons, yachts, and coaches. A great reference is, I won't say in German, but it really does lose something in the translation. The way he notes in the diary, it floors me. He says, Mr. Blandau and his crew were amazingly good sailors, not to be outdone in all of Christendom. This was on a yacht trip down the Rhine River. But mostly he traveled in the provinces of Württemberg, in the Pfalz, and in the Switzerland area. And in a way, already when he joined in the 1740s, he took the place of Rock and his travels. By the 1740s, Rock was getting old. He was confined mainly to the Isenburg area, where the Ronneburg is, and Biddingen and that area, and it wasn't able to travel so much. And Nagel really took over those travels that Rock had been doing before that. And then after Rock died, of course, he kept that up. So it's interesting because he really didn't have that much interaction with Rock. Rock was in Isenburg, Nagel was in other places. What kind of floored me in his diary entry, when Rock died, he's not afraid to write a lot in his diary, but for the diary entry for 2 March 1749, he writes simply, "Today, Brother Rock died." And that's all he wrote.
Yeah.
Interesting. Also, Raiden. If he's not traveling, he's talking. Okay, he visits with many, many people, and he writes their names down. I mentioned yesterday that we've started a database of names of whenever it was, not yesterday, last week, that we are starting a database of names, and that database does not include everybody referenced by Nagel in his diary. It's not an exaggeration to say that there are probably over 20,000 names listed in his diary. And a lot of them are repeats, of course, but he's always talking. He's always mentioning who he's talking to, who he's visiting, who have come to visit him. It's amazing. And one thing the diary shows because of that, I think, is that there were many more followers and sympathizers of the Inspirationists, if not actually members. And I talked about the difficulty last week of saying who a member was. They might not have been members, but they were interested people. Nagel drew a crowd when he came. People came from miles around, as they say. He talks about rooms being overflowing. It really, I think it shows that there was much more interest than usually the secondary literature, the histories talk about, as in that later 18th century. Common topics of conversation he talked about: community, he talked about separatism, he talked about baptism, he talked about communion. They had debates with the Herrnhuter. They had debates with he recounts an interesting debate with a Quaker about whether or not hats should be worn during church services. So there's just all kinds of stuff there. And in fact, I think Nagel's diary is in effect a record of his efforts to unite a community of believers, to strengthen people's faith, and to encourage them in their spiritual walk. It is full of instances where he intercedes or mediates personal conflicts among people, or that he has private or Hausunterredung, spiritual examinations of just 2 or 3 people rather than a whole assembly or congregation. And again, I showed this quote last week, but I think this is Nagel in a nutshell, where he says in his diary on 17 March 1755, "The important thing is to build communities, to unite the members in love so that all should become one in Christ. For this purpose and end, the Lord sent his divine Spirit to be among us." That's Paul Nagel right there. And I just want to throw this out. When you look at the German phrase, Die wahren Inspirationsgemeinde, the usual translation is the community of true inspiration. I just want to suggest you could translate it differently and get a whole different view of what's happening if you translate it as the true community of inspiration. I don't think we should do that, but but it's an interesting exercise. For me, it changes my perspective of what was going on there, especially by Nagel's time. And in Gruber's time, maybe true inspiration was the thing, but by Nagel's time, the true community was the thing. Then he's also rhyming. This is an original document too. It's Gedanken über das Nagelsche Wappen. Thoughts on, contemplation on the Nagel coat of arms. And he drew a little coat of arms there, so that you can tell he was from a well-to-do family if they had a coat of arms. And but it's all in poem. In other words, when he thinks in rhymes. He's always doing poems. In July of 1761, he took a trip to Holland, a very long trip. It took a couple months. His account of that journey is all in rhyme. Okay, it's unbelievable. He gives accounts of the Unterredung, the spiritual examinations. He does that in rhyme as well. He does contemplations on biblical passages, on Bible verses, all in rhyme. In one diary entry, when he was in Schaffhausen, he says, I didn't have time in my visit to keep my diary up, so I'm going to try to catch up now to the best of my memory. And then he proceeds to write 67 verses, a poem on his visit to Schaffhausen that week before, really. So it's amazing. He often even writes letters. He does lots of correspondence with people, and even sometimes his letters are done in rhyme. We saw last week that Rock did the same thing. Rock wrote that letter to Haldy that was in rhyme. He loves language. He likes to play with words. This is one of my favorite things. He uses anagrams. He uses anagrams a lot. If you look here, he signed it. You know, I looked this up, and I used to know Latin way back when, but I can't figure out what this is. It makes no sense to me. It means light pages. No, it means, light pages, short misery. That's about what it says. I don't know what that means. But anyway, that's the Latin phrase. But then underneath he wrote, whoever can unscramble this will know the author. And of course, it's his PGN, Paul Giesebert Nagel, is hidden in that anagram. And we've got lots of examples of that. He loves to play with words. He loves language. And as I want to suggest that he isn't alone. That's an inspirationist thing. It's a pietist thing. They were writing poems and songs. You look at all, our hymnal, the Salispiel, had 1,200 songs in there. People were writing poetry. It's amazing. So there's lots of stuff for scholars in Nagel's diary. We could talk about how the Unterredung, those spiritual examinations changed from the time of Gruber to the time of Nagel. You can talk about how the emphasis, in the early days there was a big strain of millenarianism, the notion that the world is going to end. By the time of Nagel, you don't see that anywhere. You're not going to build a community if you think the world's going to end tomorrow, right? So one thing I want to talk about a little more that is perhaps a little more scholarly, though, is that whole notion of Versammlung, of prayer gatherings, which the more I read in Nagel's diary, the more I had no clue what an inspirationist prayer gathering was like. I mean, the image we have in our mind is that in communal manner, right? Formal, quiet, women on one side, men on the other, very structured. But the more I read in Nagel's diary, it just didn't seem that way. Remember, back then they were holding it wherever they could. It would be in somebody's house. It would be, I had examples, Haldy held it in a former widow's home, former home for widows. Nagel talks about attending a Versammlung in an old mill. They had it upstairs in taverns. It's wherever they could, they held their prayer meetings. And the other thing then to remember is that it varied from place to place and over time. You got to remember the diversity. What happened in Liblos stayed in Liblos. It didn't necessarily translate to what they were doing in other places. Nagel also talks about sometimes he attended three prayer gatherings a day, in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. Sometimes it seems they even had separate Versammlung. He talks about going to the Weibsversammlung and then the Männerversammlung, the women's prayer gathering and the men's, prayer gathering. Other times, they're not even sitting separately in other places. So it's just the diversity, I think, is something we have to keep in mind. And talk about diversity. In Schaffhausen, here's in the diary entry in Schaffhausen on 8 October 1747. Sister Schiffmeister, for the first time, held the prayer gathering today. All right? There was a female elder in Schaffhausen in 1747. And Nagel met with her beforehand and encouraged her. And there's almost a sense of pride in his diary entry when he talks about that. So the order of worship, though, I think was pretty standard. Okay, there was that prayer, there was the opening hymn, there was a Bible reading with a Betrachtung, a commentary afterwards, and a closing hymn. What I found also interesting is that very rarely was a testimony read, which which kind of surprised me. Sometimes there was, but again, my point is, I just have to get rid of that notion of a communal Amana church service when I think about what's going on in Germany in the 18th century. We have to be careful with everything in terms of when we think about the 18th century, that we don't take communal Amana as the model. Okay, sometimes it's real easy to think, well, that's how it was done then. That must have been how they did it back then too. We have to just get rid of that notion. So there's lots of stuff for scholars to find, to mine as you would in Nagel's diary, but basically I just want to finish up by talking a little bit about Nagel the person. His diary reveals a human side, which we very rarely see in the Inspirationist history. For one thing, he talks a lot about his family, okay? His father had died when he was fairly young. His birth mother had died already when he was only 9. But his stepmother then and his grandmother are super important to him. He's constantly writing them. He always stays with his grandmother when he's in Tübingen, and he stays with his mother, and he just calls her mother. If it's from his diary, you wouldn't know it was a stepmother. We only know that from genealogical records. But from his diary, you wouldn't know it was a stepmother. They're very close. When he's in Esslingen, and he has extended stays there, and you can see sometimes when he's traveling, he makes a little detour so that he can actually visit there. He talks about his cousins, his uncles, his aunts. He's joyful when his sister-in-law gave birth to a healthy child. He's sad when his cousin's wife died in childbirth. He's sad and writes a poem when he gets a letter from his brother that his grandmother had died. and one of the kind of humanizing entries that struck me was, he said, last night I had dinner at my brother Ferdinand's with sister, mother, uncle, etc., etc. But there were so many others there that we could barely talk among ourselves. So, I mean, yeah, that's just kind of cool, I think. He's also independently wealthy. He didn't have to work. Okay, so whatever he did, whatever family he came from, he had money there. And in fact, he paid a lot. He paid his own way, and he paid for community expenses as well. Like that book I showed you that he had published, he paid for that himself. And it's true for other things as well. So if he had any occupation, we don't know. but he dabbled in landscape architecture. There's two examples where he's talking about going to a certain person's place and making a plan, measuring and making a plan for a house and hof, rissa, a plan for a house for that landscape, and then how he gives, and he even one day dragged Jonas Wickmark along to help him make the measurements. So he's dabbling in landscape architecture, but not professionally, I wouldn't say. It's just an interest of his. He's well respected, obviously, and well connected. He's constantly writing fellow inspirationists, community elders. He's writing to Johann Adam Gruber in America. One thing he's writing Gruber about is hey, you got any old testimonies you can send me? You know, because he was compiling this Haupt register. And then after Gruber died, he kept corresponding with Gruber's eldest daughter as well. There's Johannes Claris, a businessman in Frankfurt who is vitally important to the community, kind of their business agent. He's constantly dealing with them. When he visits cities, he's not afraid to stop in and talk to the city ministers, the city council, or the Lutheran minister at the time. He's well connected. When he goes to university towns, he stops and talks to professors. And now I just want to drop a few names. He personally visits and corresponds with Gerhard ter Stegen, who Emily talked about, probably the preeminent hymnist and poet, a pietist poet of the late 18th century. Moses Mendelssohn, the premier Hebrew Jewish scholar in the late 18th century. He corresponds with him. Lavater, a Swiss poet, writer, philosopher who had some weird ideas, and kind of had from what I read, kind of a little conflict with Nagel, but still was a guest at Nagel's house at one point. And George Friedrich Schmall, the famous artist who drew the portraits of Goethe, and then Johann Wolfgang von Goethe himself stopped and visited Nagel in his house. Okay, so he was well known. He was in the mix, okay, of everything. He also likes to talk about traveling. And I mean, again, some historian who would just look at this diary and see what it was like to travel in the 1860s would just have a heyday, because he goes into detail. He, again, to show this, I just had to think, hey, this is me when I read this. It says, he talks about a night in the Wirtshaus, okay, a night in the guest house, in the tavern. He goes, I should do it in German, but I won't. The bed was cold, the guests were loud, and then the band showed up. But he says, but there's no use to complain. He talks about traveling in the mountains. And again, a phrase he uses is, the path was so steep that our knees came up to our noses. They had to hire a guide to go through there. He hates traveling in the woods. He talks about the woods are a place where the Spitzbuben hang out. and that just means rascal or bad boys, basically. And he talks about being lost, getting lost in the woods and arriving at his destination late. He talked about one time he stopped and a woman offered the group some coffee. It says, refreshed us with some coffee, and that turned out to be our lunch, he said. So very interesting. He talks a lot about being tired from traveling. On 11 July 1770, he says only, war ganz wie tot. I was as if I were dead. But he still managed to write a 3-page poem that day. So he's also interested in natural phenomena. This is in this diary entry, he talks about how a friend had given him a book about comets. And then so he in his diary, he drew a little picture of the solar system with the comet coming in here. Okay, is that right? Yeah. He's interested in astronomical stuff, actually, because he mentions that there was a really great meteor shower one evening. And I think I've counted at least 4 times he talks about the northern lights and how neat they were that night. So he's tuned into that. And earthquakes. He talks about feeling earthquakes, or that an earthquake was reported somewhere else. He talks about on 13 October in 1748, the island of Dominique, okay, Port-au-Prince in the Caribbean, had experienced an earthquake, and a lot of the sugar plantations were damaged, she mentions. One of my favorite entries, in terms of his being tuned into the natural world too, is he mentions that in Ulm, in the summer of 1746, there were so many raging cats that they had to be thrown into the Danube. Now, it's Wirche. The name is Wirche. V-U-T-H-I-G-E. That's raging, right? Yeah. I think maybe he meant rabbit. Maybe they had rabies or something. But anyway, he is of course also very interested in spiritual phenomenon. And manifestations of the divine, including inspiration. He talks a lot about Christine Kreutzer and passes out her life. Christine Kreutzer was a Swiss-inspired person that Rock had visited at one point. He's copying manuscripts that pertain to the convulsionnaires in Paris and France, which is, if you want to Google convulsionnaires, that was an odd thing going on there in Paris. But he's interested in that kind of stuff as well. In other words, he's just very interested in what's happening in the world around you. Very, very human, I think. He's also interested in visual art as well as poetry. Again, just a quick sketch. This is the Schloss Reichenau in Switzerland. It's where kind of 2 branches of the Rhine come together and start their way down to the Bodensee. So he drew this map. If you look at a Google Earth image, it looks really, really close to that. He also has drawn these thought pictures. Okay, again, verses. These are all verses, but written in the shape of a cross. Okay, again, to get that visual aspect. One time, just once that I saw, he says, "Today I worked on my oil painting." Okay, so he was apparently oil painting as well. And one time he drew a picture of a friend's daughter. He sketched a friend's daughter and gave it to her. Okay, so again, he's also interested in sketches and visual arts. But I'm going to close with my favorite diary entry of Nagel. It's 20 August 1765. We're talking an 18th century earworm here. Okay? It says, "Today the melody, Macht hoch die Tür, played in my mind, played in my head." So he had this melody going through his head all day today. And I looked it up. It's Melody 98. Yeah. And the hymn is in our Sauerspiel. We don't ever use Melody 98, I don't believe. Not
all the time.
Yeah,
we do? Yeah. Sing it, Marlene.
Oh boy.
Yeah, come on. I got it going through my head. You got to get rid of it. I looked through our hymnal. I didn't see it. Yeah.
That's right.
Make high the doorway.
Yeah.
From Sunday.
Yeah, the gate. Left high the gate.
It's a Christmas song.
Yeah.
An Advent song.
Yeah. So finally, I think it seems that when he wasn't traveling or talking, Paul Giesebert Nagel had a pen in his hand, and the huge corpus of materials that we have because of him is just amazing. And we don't even have it all. There are references to other things he did that we don't have anymore, that has been lost. So through his writing, his publication efforts, and his travels, I think he really did keep the flame of faith burning in those scattered inspirationist communities. I mean, I said how diverse they were. His role was to make that diversity into one community, really. So that he kept the flame burning not only in the 18th century, but because of what he left behind still today, I think. So thank you.